Africa is a continent of immense diversity, rich cultures, and boundless potential. Yet it has long been a stage for conflicts, both inherited from colonial legacies and rooted in local complexities. From ethnic rivalries to resource disputes, these conflicts have left communities frustrated, or better still fractured, and economies stunted. However, the Africa story is not just one of struggle, it is also a tale of resilience and innovation in peacemaking. Numerous peace initiatives have been launched in decades on the African continent. Vast amounts of resources have been utilized to craft peace agreements, which have often collapsed under the weight of competing interests. As it stands, unresolved conflicts on the African continent are the Democratic Republic of Congo with unrest, Sudan, South Sudan, the Sahel region, Libya, and elsewhere. In this context, the role of solidarity amongst African nations, skillful mediation, and the revival of indigenous peace-building traditions offers a compelling lens through which the continent of Africa can attain its quest for lasting peace. Furthermore, solidarity fosters unity in the face of shared challenges, while mediation brings together ground solutions in cultural authenticity and local wisdom. Today's discussion delves into how these three pillars, that is solidarity, mediation, and indigenous pathways, can transform Africa's conflicts into opportunities for healing, justice, and sustainable development. It is a call to harness the continent's inherent strength and to reimagine peace as an attainable reality through homegrown strategies and collaborative efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Talking Point. Stay with us. It's another rendezvous of your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for joining us. And in the course of today's edition of the program, like we mentioned in our preamble, we shall focus on conflicts on the African continent. We're asking the question, what role can, of course, mediation, solidarity, and indigenous parts play towards the continent's quest for peace? This comes at a time when numerous countries on the African continent are still reeling from the impacts of conflicts over the past years. And to evoke this day, I'm being joined by Dr. Eddie Eric, who is a global politics consultant as well as the executive secretary of a Committee for Actions for Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
This raining day here on our side in Philadelphia, and I want to greet my co-panelists, Boniface at this moment as well. Greetings to all the listeners.
Thank you immensely.
Greetings, Dr. Eddie.
Thank you immensely, and that was a warm welcome. Equally, I'll now say you're welcome, Boniface Harrison, Executive Director at MUEMACTION Post, which joined us all the way from Kenya. Habari.
Jema sana. Ujambo.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for having me today, and more greetings also to Dr. Eddie, and greetings to our listeners and viewers today.
It's a pleasure to have you both experts to unpack today's topic of discussion, especially at this very much paramount time for the African continent, where Africa is on its quest to trying to change the narrative within the continent of Africa. Now, today we with you, Dr. Eddie. Many a times we have been told there are conflicts on the African continent. This sparked numerous efforts to quell some of these tensions. And as we speak, some of these tensions, these quests are yet to come to an end. Now, in a bit to comprehend the underlying causes of these conflicts which we are seeing on the African continent that could date back as far as decades and even much more. In your opinion, what are some of the primary causes of these conflicts plaguing the continent, and do they vary from region to region?
Thank you, Sharon. Unfortunately, we do have, as you said, so many ongoing conflicts, new emerging conflicts, in Africa, which, of course, are related to quite a number of factors. We can categorize them if we want, but, when we start by looking at the nature of those conflicts, in general, we are looking at intra conflicts.
Exactly.
Very rarely we see conflict between two countries. When those conflicts, were emerging nowadays, at least you can take the period since the 1990s, these are conflicts that are either related to a dispute of land, or it can be a dispute of natural resources. We have seen it in the case of Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Island, for instance. We have seen it in the case of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, even over an oil offshore or oil, resources, as I will say, and many of those conflicts are like that. But those type of conflicts, as we have seen between these African countries, have not necessarily led to the eruption of violence. Of course, we have what is happening in the eastern part of Congo, whereby the Congolese authorities continue to accuse the Rwandese army and the Rwandese authorities of fuming and fostering this kind of conflict in the Eastern Democratic of Congo by supporting, armed groups and rebels. And we have these kind of things, but it has not led, as I say, to an open and blown conflict between countries. So the point is, most of the conflict that we are looking at today are intra-African countries, conflict, meaning conflict that are happening within those African countries. And I do remember early in the 2000s, around, the time President Mbeki was rising
South
to
African
leadership,
president.
that the scholarship at the time called for a reinvention of the peace and conflict resolution mechanism to be adequate and reflect the type of conflict that Africa is dealing with nowadays. Of course, as we look at the Sahel area, for instance, we have the rise of these insurgencies. The debate can also go over that in terms of the nature, the origin, and the factors that are fueling these insurgencies in the Sahel countries, for instance. But we can also talk about election-related violence, which also is another gun or another nuclear weapon, I will call it like that, quote unquote, because we know the number of people in Africa or the number of countries that have descended in shambles after elections. So there is, the landscape and the spectrum of conflict in Africa today is very broad and being fueled by quite a number of factors. We can look at the land issue, for instance, between the shepherds and the farmers in places like Nigeria, Ghana, and sometimes even Cote d'Ivoire, where you have a conflict again, over lands. We can also have a conflict that nowadays are also arising over other type of land disputes when you have communities that are growing, thinking that what they do not have the right to land, while others have the right to land, or incomers or incoming populations were trying to take away too much of their lands. You have this kind of disputes also that affect so many of the African countries. Of course, at a lesser level, if we want, we can also talk about what some other factors. I did mention election-related violence. This also creates quite a number of conflicts in our African countries. But let us not forget the external factors. Let us not forget the external factors. When we look at what happened in Libya, we do understand that this type of conflict also are fueled by powers that are outside of the African continent itself.
Absolutely.
So this is the very broad, spectrum of the conflicts that the African countries are dealing with today, and I am pleased to know that efforts to bring in an African solution to African problems when it comes to those conflicts continue to be part of the scholarship, continue to be part of the discussion among intellectuals, among country leaders, among politicians, and even among faculty members in different political science or sociology departments all over Africa.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Eddie, for that very impactful introduction as far as today's topic of discussion is concerned. And that leads me to you, Harrison. Of course, it's worth noting that this conflict on the African continent might be, sparked due to numerous reasons, like quoted your co-panelist, Dr. Eddie. Now, looking at colonial legacies, how have these various colonial legacies become? When you look at the continent of Africa, you know, African countries have been colonized by different external entities, and how have they contributed towards, like, to the persistence of this conflict which we are seeing on the African continent? Or could we say that it is some sort of the impact of a soft power politics within the continent of Africa?
Okay, thank you, Sharon. And straight to the point that you have raised about the impact of the colonial powers, the colonialism that happened in Africa towards the conflicts that are happening today, is that generally colonization brought Africa to a new dispensation. The emergence of the current civilization that we have today, it was a complete revolution, because this is not how Africa was.
True.
And just to start from when colonization started, that is where conflict started in Africa, because some of the African communities started by resisting colonialism. And that was because sociologically, change is very difficult to take. And so, as I mentioned before, colonialism was a huge revolution in Africa. And so the first response of the communities of Africa was to resist. And that is what led to the fights that were led, for example, in Kenya by the Mau Mau. The people used to go to the forests and fight the white people, because the white people came to take the most fertile lands in Africa. They came to actually take the best of everything in Africa. And that was the first instance of conflict. It brought really a lot of suffering and a lot of pain and even loss of lives, because if you remember what happened in Tanzania, for example, when story is told about Germans, how the German kids used to shoot Tanzanians like birds, the way you would go to a lake and you do shooting to birds, and that was one of the hobbies that German kids used to do. So it was really an introduction of fighting, because as Africans before, we had our own conflicts where we used to fight over land, used to fight over cultural beliefs and misdemeanors. But now here was a white person who has come and has totally changed our society. So that is where the impact of colonialism started, when we started fighting against colonialism. And that was also the introduction of guns in Africa. Africa didn't fight using guns. We used to fight with arrows, bows, casting a spell on one another. Those were the kind of fighting techniques that people had. But now here we are. Actually, one of the reasons why a lot of times Africans were defeated in their resistance was because of the inferior weapons. So weaponry, the modern weapons, came to Africa. And now, even after immediately after colonization, when you look at a country like Rwanda, the kind of genocide that they went through, the conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsi, was actually largely as a result of the legacy of colonialism. Because there was one community which was believed to be more light-skinned than another, and they were thought to be most important. And the other community that had more dark skin was thought to be weaker. And so tribalism, actually coupled up with racism, brought such a conflict. That was a conflict that was actually mostly motivated by how you look, how white you look, and how black you look. So that was another instance of the legacy of colonialism. Also, you remember that before colonialism, there was missionary missions in Africa, where we had religions like Christianity coming into Africa. Even I believe Islam was not originally from Africa. And so there was the introduction of faith in terms of whether you are African Inland Church, whether you are Methodists, whether you are all the other types of faiths that were in Africa. And then there was Islam. Actually, those were the biggest, those are still the biggest religions that exist in Africa, Christianity and Islam. And when you look at a country like Nigeria, the kind of fight that they went through because of religion, because Christians are fighting with Muslims and vice versa. And when you look at instances like even what motivates Al-Shabaab, the motivation of Al-Shabaab sometimes is also a religious affair, which also stems in. And we see sometimes when such the groups attack a community or a church, it takes a religious direction. So religion, which has sparked, actually, many people say that if you don't want to start a conflict with a person, don't talk about politics and religion. And that is because they are very emotive issues that, if not discussed with a lot of delicacy, they might lead a society to very big conflict because they are matters of faith and spirituality. So that was another legacy of colonialism that has led Africa to modern conflicts. And generally now to the kind of democracy that they brought us, the ways of governance. You know, in the past in Africa, when a king is in power, people would definitely not be thinking about who will be the next king, because they knew that definitely the firstborn of the king will take over and the lineage will proceed like that. But now with colonialization and with the new system of government, we were subjected to elections. And as my co-panelist mentioned about some politics, some conflicts that are spurred by politics. Now like for example, in Kenya, we had elections in 2022. Right now, we're supposed to have elections in 2027. Right now, people are still declaring that they will be vying in 2027. Yet the current president is still 2 years in office. Even the current president is also eyeing for 2027. So you look at it, and it's a whole campaign to another campaign. And this system of government is the one that has led us to some prosperity in terms of the development and freedoms that we have gotten. But we have also seen countries going into anarchy, where military coups overthrow a government. And for example, you remember a country like Uganda, they used to have coups almost every month, until Museveni who still took over through a coup is the current president. So you can imagine the kind of anxiety, the kind of conflicts. And it is even said that some Ugandans don't vote for Museveni because they like him. They are afraid of another conflict. So you can see even any country that goes through a military coup, it's destabilized. And we have seen countries like Sudan, where military coups have taken place and rebel groups are wreaking havoc in those countries. Even a country like Haiti, although it's not in Africa, those are countries that have seen military coups, they have seen instability in their governance, and it has led to a lot of conflict, a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of fighting. Even recently, we got reports that there were fights in Sudan, and Salva Kiir was not known where he is. Even countries like Somalia. So democracy, the new system of governance, has also led us to conflicts a lot. And another final legacy of colonialism is the kind of economics, the kind of society that we used to have. In the past, we used to have a society that is based on the community feeling, the feeling of belonging in a community, the feeling of caring for one another. But with capitalism, people don't care about one another as they used to. Things have changed. They say every man for himself and God for us all. And I think that the aspect of capitalism has actually brought a lot of conflict in Africa because of the scramble for resources. Yeah, where people want to take over what belongs to others by coercion, by fighting, where things like land grabbing, things like other communities that want to occupy other communities by force, individuals who want to wreak havoc, yeah, even things like thievery and burglary. Those are all the consequences of the new civilization that we have. So indeed, colonialization has had a lot of impact and contribution to the conflicts that we have in Africa, although also the colonization came with some of the modern ways of resolving conflict, as you had mentioned earlier about mediation and solidarity. There is the court system, there are security agencies, there are alternative dispute resolution measures. So while colonization left an impact of new types of conflicts, also colonization came with it some other new ways of resolving conflict other than the ones that we have. So in a nutshell, that is what I would say has been the impact of colonization in Africa with regard to the conflicts that we are having today.
Indeed, it's quite a complex one, and of course, that's why we're trying to, comprehend some of the complexities that are around these issues on the African continent. How can Africa entangle, or better still, disassociate itself from these numerous issues and external factors, affecting the continent of Africa? Back to you, Dr. Eddie. You listened to your co-panelists, and earlier on, you mentioned the issue of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and you cited some of the remarks of Thabo Mbeki. Indeed, the former South African president had made very powerful remarks as far as resolving these conflicts on the African continent is concerned, particularly speaking about the issue in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, in your previous response, you cited that these conflicts might be, sparked by different issues from culture to, for quest for land and others. Now, what role do ethnic as well as cultural differences play in fueling, or better still, resolving conflicts on the African continent?
Sharon, I want to answer this question by using some examples from Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm sure that as African people looking at the culture, looking and relying on what what the great Sheikh Anta Diop said, for instance, in terms of the similarities of the of Black African cultures, that can resonate somewhere. When you take a country such as Cote d'Ivoire, you have a mosaic of about 60 different ethnic group or sub groups in there. What in the past maintained some sort of stability in the country beyond and helped, what the political leaders during the time of the one-party state is not just the political, should I say, skills, right, of the leadership at the time, but it was the ability to rely on some ethnic alliances that existed and till today continue to inform the relationship between different ethnic groups. If you take the case of the people from my ethnic group, for instance, compared to another ethnic group in Cote d'Ivoire that you call the Dida, they have a multi-secular and long-standing ancestral alliance, right, whereby the, should I say, the history, the story, the mythology of the growth of these two ethnic groups see them as partners whereby blood should not be shed between them because of what happened in the past. And because blood should not be shed, and they are very version of that story, it talks about, how it is possible for me, for instance, when I find myself in a Dida village, to be able to do whatever I want to do, especially when there is a funeral. I have the ability to tell that, hey, listen, I don't want the deceased person to be buried by now. I want it at this particular time. And this kind of things that were respected, they were valued, they were anchored in some tradition that people believe in. As a result of that, it played in some sort of, again, alliances, partnership, and which help resolve a certain conflict that may emerge even between individuals in the workplace. I live here in the city of Philadelphia. Most of my very close friends are people from this ethnic group that I'm talking about. And this kind of alliances do exist among different ethnic groups, which again, as I said, were contributed to preserving a peace, resolving emerging conflicts, resolving full-blown conflicts among these different groups. And I believe that, as we talked about the legacy of colonization, one thing that what we are certain of is that colonization, slavery to begin with, then colonization did not wipe out completely the African cultures that we have. If there is anything, as a professor, the late Professor Ali Mazrui said, there is a legacy of where pre-colonial Africa or pre-slavery, during slavery, pre-colonial, post-colonial, and also the addition of new cultures and ways that we may have inherited, of course, observed as human beings from abroad by way of colonization and by way of today, quote-unquote, globalization and what we are being interpenetrated by. However, the African cultures have not, died out. Today in Ghana, there still exists the Akan people. To the point that, when an authority in Cote d'Ivoire died, for instance, and belonged to that ethnic group, the leader or the king of the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana sent in some representative. I believe that, this is where President Thabo Mbeki, with his institutes, right, and his foundation,
yes,
is going. We do remember, Sharon, that, when President Mbeki was in power, of course, as the head of the African Union also at the time, he came in with a new strategy, a new way of resolving African conflicts, which we have called, insisting on African solutions for African problems. What did President Mbeki, say? Let us have those leaders representing countries or representing, warring factions in the country come together without the presence or the input of any foreign leaders, especially from the Western world. And let's sit and talk. We also remember that, during the time, President Mbeki was very well criticized, right, for not being too heavy on President Robert Mugabe, for instance, during the time, there was an internal crisis between him and the opposition leader at the time. President Mbeki, if I do remember very well, responded by saying that imposing sanctions, the sanction regimes that have been imposed on one leader to the detriment of another or to the benefit of another did not necessarily resolve those issues. What did we see? The needle was moved. Same strategy was used in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, with the different agreements, whereby the peace agreements, or the negotiation in Paris, Kleber stalled between 2002 and 2003 in the civil war that, Cote d'Ivoire experienced, for instance, when a group of rebels, took over and split the country into two. We saw that, the intervention of President Mbeki really moved the different factions toward a resolution, of course, which led to the election that took place in 2010. Unfortunately, we can also claim that, it was not all perfect, because those elections also led to another post-election violence that led to over 3,000 people being dead. So, coming back to that, Sharon, I just want to land on that and say that, yes, our traditional ways still exist. And this is the reason why an institute like the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and many other things that exist today in Africa, in our universities, or even being created by political parties, need to come back to the drawing board. And I say this to actually analyze the type of conflict that what we are experiencing today, and mirror that with ways in which we use to resolve those conflicts, and come up with what I will call a very authentic African way, African modern way, whatever you want to call it, of resolving those conflicts. It is possible. Why? Again, because our original, our African cultures are still in existence. People still speak Swahili today. People speak Lingala today. People today continue to worship, ancestral gods. Even those who are Christians, as my co-panelists, were mentioned, the way we worship as Christians in Africa, of course, completely different from the ways in which, we worship or people worship or Christian worship all over the world. So culture truly infuses everything that we do. It is a high time that the resolution of a conflict in Africa also follow that same pattern.
Exactly, and that is equally a code that reflects, this a need for collective effort on the continent of Africa, like you rightfully put, Dr. Eddie. Now, back to you, Harrison. You listen to Dr. Eddie, and I'll just go down that light this time around to, to go down the line of the vein of the African Union. We've seen the call for African solidarity in recent years. Like Dr. Eddie was saying, there is this need for Africans to solve African problems through African solutions. Now, in your perspective, how has African regional solidarity as exemplified by the African Union impacted conflict resolution efforts in recent years? We have seen the emergence, now looking at the aspects of conflicts on the African continent, we've seen the emergence of the initiative of silencing the guns by the African Union that was initially targeted for 2020, but was later on postponed to 2030. We are about 5 years away from this goal of 2030, yet we still have these numerous conflicts on the African continent. So do you believe that this, African regional solidarity has been able to impact conflict resolution within the continent? Harrison, are you with us?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I am. So, Sharon, rightly, HeyU is a good platform for presidents to meet, exchange ideas, and think about what to do for Africa. But there is a challenge that faces the African Union, and that is, actually, there are two challenges. One of the challenges is intentionality in its leadership and the resourcing of the African Union. Because African Union as a solidarity organization as well also has a mandate of liberating Africa from neocolonialism. This is impossible if African Union is going to be too dependent on funding from other continents, some of which colonized Africa. And the aspect of resourcing is the one that has led to failure in some of the missions that the AU sets out to achieve. Because the only way you can be able to implement what you suggest is if you can actually fund it. So we have an African Union that hardly is able to fund itself. And the other aspect of intentionality is that for many years, we have not had a very robust African Union leadership because even while this agenda is set to silence the guns in Africa by 2030, what is the clarion call? Do we see the African Union leadership rallying Africa towards silencing of guns? That is the first thing. Do we see energy? Do we see enthusiasm towards this goal? Is there passion towards silencing of guns in Africa? Yeah. So that, to me, has not been existing. And apart from the synergy and the passion, do we have real actions that are being taken towards actualizing the vision of silencing guns in Africa? Do we have actual soldiers from the African Union who are fighting in other countries? Well, Some would say there are soldiers who are dedicated to African missions. Like, for example, recently the Kenyan army was part of the peacekeeping mission in DRC. And also we have been in Somalia as well, peacekeeping mission. But does the African Union have control over the same thing with the UN? What is the capacity of these organizations towards actually being in charge of a mission and leading it to its success? And what is the implication when African Union is going to silence guns in an area that is benefiting the people who fund it? Is the African Union still going to be focused about that mission? So that is the challenge we have had about African Union. It is a very potential. Recently, I even heard that there are many things. The Kenyan president was speaking at the AU and was talking about very many departments that are not operational, yeah, where people discuss too many things, night-long meetings. For example, and this is not to be biased in any way, recently the AU meeting, a recent AU meeting was held in Nairobi in a foreign facility. Foreign facility. You are sure that is a facility that is fitted with audio recorders, video cameras. And I was wondering, did African presidents fail to get a neutral place where they can have a meeting to discuss about African issues? So we have a very big problem with that organization. And I think the best that it can do is if, first of all, African Union can fund itself, and if the leadership of the African Union will be intentional, passionate, and robust about championing African affairs. I think for the first time, I don't know if it's because I have reached an age where I'm following the developments too much, but I think for the first time we are having an African discussion about the AU chairperson position. I think for the last several terms, we haven't had a robust talk, because right now we know we have a Kenyan candidate, we have a Djibouti candidate, we had a Madagascar candidate. So right now I think the conversation is moving. But even if we know that this is happening, where are they going? Are they going to find empty coffers? Are they going to find a house of rhetoric and too much discussion without tangible solutions? So I think facilities like the African Development Bank could have been more impactful in funding African affairs. I am not quite sure about their contribution towards the African Union and towards critical issues that affect African countries, because sometimes funding goes to very local issues, while countries are going through very macro issues that are impacting and leading to the minor issues. For example, you find organizations being funded in countries like Sudan to alleviate some kind of problems. Yet we know very well that the root cause of most of the problems in Sudan is the conflict that is happening. So I think it is important for major funders, major decision makers to focus more on the major challenges that a country is facing, rather than the local challenges that are being faced by the people. Because if we are able to fix the major issues, the local issues will be minimal. I think another challenge we have had with the African Union is because many presidents are still not in terms. They do not agree with each other too much on many things. Recently, we saw, I wouldn't want to mention names very much, but the conflict that is happening in Sudan, there was a time when they were choosing who should be part of that discussion. We have had African presidents being accused of
supporting,
going to
taking sides. No,
Hello?
please proceed. Please proceed.
Okay, so I just to finish, I'm saying that there are sometimes when we have had some African presidents, when they send a peacekeeping delegation of soldiers and police men and women, they are accused of actually going to perpetuate more war. For example, we have had the discussion that goes around the border of DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda. There's a lot of discussion that happens there about who is funding what, who is ferrying which minerals to who is working with which foreign powers. So again, there is the issue of mistrust among the AU members. And some AU members are accused of pushing the oppressors' narrative, being part of the conflicts that are intentionally caused. Because if you observe keenly an area that is discovered with minerals, an area that is discovered with oil, suddenly conflicts come from nowhere. And you see now things have changed everywhere. So we have that challenge as well. We have the challenge of African presidents who are not pushing the AU mission, even while it is not much aggressive and robust about African issues. So AU is a good place, but we need to actually have it funded independently and have the AU leadership robust and passionate enough about African issues. I think that is going to lead to genuine pursuit of peace. Because sometimes you might find that sometimes what people do in Africa is not genuinely what is supposed to be done. Yeah. And that is because there is motivation of money. You will see an organization, a group of people, even a country changing their agenda because they want to align themselves with funding. They want to paint a picture that they need money to do this. And so you'll see even countries pushing agendas that they did not believe in or they are not a priority to their people. So we need to know if African Union is genuinely interested in silencing the guns, or this is just a cosmetic agenda to look with a commitment or to even be considered for more resourcing by those who facilitate. So going forward, we need more aggressiveness needs to be seen towards solving African challenges.
Exactly, and of course it's up to Africans to be able to take that bold step if they want to see the change come to the continent. Now back to you, Dr. Eddie. Previously you mentioned that there is need for collective effort on the African continent in resolving some of these challenges which we see on the African continent, and I would like to take us back in time. We remember the Ethiopian Tigray crisis that erupted in the Horn of African region. And we saw, collective effort from previous presidents, the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, the former Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, and others that stood firm in seeing that this conflict actually was resolved through mediation. When you look at this conflict, now, away from what happened in Ethiopia, with the numerous conflicts that are still ongoing on the African continent, what are some of the successful examples of solidarity-driven initiatives to resolve conflicts within African countries that could be, pinpointed in present day?
This issue of solidarity is also a call for scrutiny. Of course, Sharon, there are some examples, of successful examples of interventions by African leaders in mediating, with some conflicts to silence the guns or making sure that any blown out conflict, is delayed. I can quote the example of the ECOMOG, right? The peacekeeping force that the West African countries mounted. Of course, with support from the international community in the 1990s in the case of the Liberian Civil War. these ECOMOG troops, or these ECOMOG troops were in majority built up, by Nigerian forces that intervene in there. Up to today, I do have some close friends from Liberia who remember that it was the Nigerian soldiers, part of the ECOMOG, that saved their lives. This is one of successful examples in there, even though a lot of reports also indicate that there has been some mishaps when it comes to how the ECOMOG, essentially led by Nigerian troops, intervene in the Liberian case. You have that as an example. Another example, as I said, was the successful mediation that President Nelson Mandela, the late Nelson Mandela, led during the time of his presidency, again in the Congo. And that was the peace talk between the sitting president, the then president Mobutu Sese Seko, and Kabila. Laurent Désiré Kabila, the father. And I believe that, the negotiations, I remember, took place, on board of the South African, Navy ship that came by there in the Congo. These are some of the examples. Of course, we cannot put aside or forget what President Thabo Mbeki was able to do in the case of the Zimbabwean conflict. Sharon, in the flow of conflicts and the crises that we are talking about in Africa today, some little gains in terms of conflict resolutions and peace mediation, some little gains, are very definitely examples that, should be quoted, because it is one success after the other that leads to a greater, larger, bigger, more significant, success to silence the gun or resolve whatever conflict or crises that are in there. Another example of solidarity, as we talk about, we can go back to what happened in Liberia in the 1990s. This Liberian conflict, were blown out or started, on December 24th, 1989, on the eve of Christmas. We all remember when President Samuel Doe was captured, assassinated by rebel groups, and of course, were fighting factions. But when the civil war in Liberia broke out, people ran. And here, when I say people, I'm talking about families. I'm talking about, non-fighting individuals, non-soldiers, right, run to different countries. And that's where we also saw an example of solidarity. In the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, which is a neighboring country, the Liberian people who entered the country were never put in what we'll call a refugee camp. No. They were hosted by families, and the government made sure that they were fully integrated. Up to today, in the conversation, as Liberia is also trying to rebuild and making this effort to rebuild, you have individuals that continue to talk about how they were put up in Cote d'Ivoire, how they stay in Cote d'Ivoire, help them to go through the trauma that the war brought to them. Of course, many lives that were lost in there. You also have where, Sharon, we have the confusion is one way showing solidarity, but at the same time also the same country that is showing solidarity, should we say, helping or taking sides. Where am I going with this example? Let's take the case of the Biafran War that took place in Nigeria in the early years of this country's independence. I believe it was between 1963 and 1967 when the eastern part of Nigeria under Colonel, Ojukwu at the time, vowed to secede from the Federation of Nigeria. And we know that, what this war led to. In the meantime, you also have a lot of Biafrans, Eastern Nigerians, who found refuge in a country such as Cote d'Ivoire. This is an example of a solidarity, but at the same time, you also have accusations from the federal government of Nigeria saying that the reason why Ivory Coast was able to put up a host and welcome all these refugees from the eastern part of Nigeria is because the government of Cote d'Ivoire was in support of the secession, which was somewhere also instrumented or being pushed by France Afrique or by France, in that agenda because of the eastern part of Nigeria being a very oil-rich, area. So the notion of solidarity here, again, needs to be reviewed. There are some examples. But at the same time, also, there are some confusion when it comes to that one as well. Another example of solidarity, which will not necessarily in terms of a conflict or fighting, but that on many occasions you have had some African countries showing some sort of support to the neighboring countries when it comes to natural disaster. For instance, as we talk about crisis, we know that natural disasters can also be a triggerer over these crises that what we have in there. The fact that after a flood in a country, I believe it was somewhere in Guinea or another, the Ivory Coast, where President, for instance, was able to send in aid, financial aid to help it in there. This kind of solidarity do exist. How much? How heavy? What is the impact when it comes to resolving conflicts? That's where, again, the question is. But I believe that, there are some example of success in there. Unfortunately, where the confusion also set in is that, when we look at what happened in the Sahel, for instance, with the coup that happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, automatically you have these regime sanctions that were imposed, borders were closed, and the ECOWAS country leaders decided to impose economic sanctions between their countries and Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These kind of sanctions weighed more on the population, kills the local and the small micro economy, if we can say that, and did not show this kind of solidarity, if you want, that the Malian people, the Niger people, or the Burkina Faso people were expected to receive from neighboring countries, for instance. So, Sharon, there are some examples, but also a lot of confusion in there in terms of those things. But for somebody in landing on that question like me, who always come when it comes to African issues from an Afro-optimistic, perspective, I believe that, we can build more on those small examples of a solidarity that works more than looking at where we failed, because where we fail is exactly what we wanted to defeat, what we wanted to do, where we want to do better.
And indeed, those are some of the points that show that Africa does have a role to play. Individual countries do have a role to play as far as solidarity on the African continent is concerned in mediating some of these conflicts. Why not extending a hand to one on the African continent, a bit to influence more peace building efforts across Africa? Now, over to you. Harrison, you listened to Dr. Eddie. Now, moving forward on seeing how we could, integrate sustainable peace on the African continent, how can African nations better integrate mediation within long-term development strategies to ensure sustainable peace within Africa? Like your co-panelist stated, in times of conflict, we always have countries, welcoming neighboring persons or in citizens from other countries in a bid to help them, scrap off the tension which they have lived with. So with all this, how can these various nations across Africa, try to integrate mediation as some sort of long-term development strategy for the betterment of peace-building efforts?
Yeah, actually picking up from the point of Afro-optimism, where we believe that our continent has great potential and a brighter future for peace and the next generation. I believe that Africa can be peaceful and guns can be silent in this way. For example, talking about mediation, in 2007, our country was in huge conflict where there was an election dispute and the country went to violence. And actually another example that has worked of mediation is when Kofi Annan came to Kenya and had a meeting with the warring sides, and peace was restored. So mediation has a chance. We have also seen former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, has been in several countries trying to cause peace and discussion and negotiations. So I think, and we've seen, but sometimes when African top leaders embrace dialogue and prioritize the countries of selfish interest, some of them are sometimes called sellouts, because sometimes the African politics are so charged that followers do not want their candidate to choose any ways of peace, because sometimes choosing peace is seen as weakness. So I think also as African people, we need to embrace and change our perspectives about solving disputes, because you will see, for example, in an election, if I support candidate X and another person supports candidate Y, then when my candidate wins or the candidate wins, I want to keep on holding onto my side and believing that our election was rigged and we should fight for what belongs to us, and this country should not proceed if our person is not in office. I think such hard and adamant stance are the ones that we need to eliminate as Africans, and agree that in elections specifically,
Yes.
that it is possible to win and it is also possible to lose an election. So that is where we should first start. We need to change our minds and move on very fast from contentious issues like elections, because really elections have led Africa to very huge, to pay very high cost of violence and loss of property, and even disruption of livelihoods in general. The other aspect is the internal conflicts that arise between communities, between faiths. And I think there are many organizations, very many passionate individuals who are working towards peace awareness, being peace ambassadors. And it is our role as Africans and also to our viewers to always remember that your brother, your sister, your neighbor is your neighbor, despite the kind of faith that they believe in, besides the kind of political party that they are in. It is important for us to prioritize humanity over the kind of labels that you've been given here on Earth, because we are first humans, we are first Africans, we are first brothers and sisters, before we become anything else that could lead us to violence. Mediation has a very huge potential, but it's also important for African presidents to be very intentional about safeguarding their borders and being jealous about Africa, because sometimes we sell Africa too cheap when we go to bed with people who don't mean well for Africa, and they end up starting conflicts from inside. I have heard of a story where a certain president in Africa was approached by a foreign country that they wanted to deposit their wastes, and they thought that that country had land that could allow the deposition of waste. So the president was very fast to say, it's okay, you can come and pour anything that you want to pour here. Literally, did the president know that? Or maybe the president was given money, the president was given some favors. But today we are talking about that waste was chemical waste, very radioactive waste, which is now leading that community to cancer. There are many cases of cancer in that area. So that is symbolically to mean that African presidents need to be careful about the kind of deals that they are lured into, because sometimes you may give a camel a chance to put in the head, and then it starts complaining that it wants to put the ham inside as well. So we need that is point number 3. We need to be very careful about the kind of deals that we get into, the kind of protection that, because that is the strategy that even the colonizers used. They used to come and lure a chief and tell them, we want to protect you, we want to give you guns to be safe. And the moment the chief would collaborate, all the land was gone and the chief would no longer be a chief anymore. So that is another point. And we need the rise of very genuine and well-meaning Africans to lead peace. Because, for example, people like Nelson Mandela, people like Thabo Mbeki, people like Kofi Annan, and I think Uhuru Kenyatta, our former president, is really taking the front lead. I think we need more of African presidents who are genuine and passionate about tackling African issues, so that dialogue can be given more priority over violence and conflict. And I think if we reach a point where we can embrace one another as brothers and sisters and choose dialogue over conflict, Africa will really move forward. Because, for example, just imagine in Kenya, recently when we had the Gen Z revolution, the Gen Z demonstrations about cost of living and taxes and unemployment, it was really destructive because, for example, I'm in Nairobi right now, and there are shops that closed in Nairobi indefinitely. Those people will never open their shops. Others were vandalized and they had to do a whole refurbishing. And that was really too much cost that was put into our economy, into our livelihoods. There are people who lost their lives. There are people who got injured. Others have become disabled. Yet the final decision was that the finance bill that time was dropped. Why would have the finance bill not been dropped before all that suffering, all that destruction happened? So that level of adamance of Africans, I think, is also what we need to put an end to. We have cultures of different societies where the moment a president or a senior government official or just a certain civil servant somewhere thinks that he is not working within the interest of the people, they resign. But we don't see that in Africa. We see people who are just adamant, people who want to coerce their power and push it down the throats of people. And this is to the expense of livelihoods and even the economy that countries are struggling to build. So those are some of the perspectives that I would have about how we can embrace dialogue. And I think one of the biggest benefits, achievements that have happened in Africa is the courts. I think the courts in any country that I have heard of, the courts have been doing a bit of good work in terms of safeguarding peace and enhancing justice access to people, because most of the issues have been resolved through court. And I think that is a good direction that we need to go as Africans. We need to put up a culture of obeying court orders and having courts that are professional and that inspire hope in terms of providing justice. Because you find that parliaments, even executives of the countries, are very biased and corrupted. But when it comes to the judiciaries, they, at some point, many times stand with the on the side of the people. So those are my ideas about how Africa can be able to solve conflicts. And I think, well, the last one, which is not related to mediation, the best solution to Africa's end of conflicts is also the uplifting of people's livelihoods. Because when people are poor, they are very gullible. Yeah, you'll find that people have been given very less than $1 or even very small amount of money, and they will be very passionate about going to start a conflict, being goons, the idea of goonism. I was talking to a friend recently, and he had a friend who had come from Japan, and they were telling me that in Japan there is no conflict. People don't fight, people don't steal from one another. And I was wondering, what kind of a society is that, where people don't steal from one another, they don't fight because of poverty and poor living conditions. That's where you find that in Africa, campaign rallies are filled to the brim. You'll go to other countries and it's campaign time and you can hardly see people in a rally.
Wow.
Yeah, people are just campaigning, others are doing their business. So I think uplifting the people's welfare and unfortunately, just to sum up, poverty has been used as an item of trade in Africa, where many people want to keep on promoting and enhancing poverty instead of alleviating it, because by enhancing poverty, you have more people who depend on you, people who are happy when you give them $1, people who can cheer for you, people who you can hire cheaply as goons to go and cause violence. So while we might think of the conflict to a large extent of where countries are in instability, we also have levels of conflict where the communities are at conflict. Individuals, neighbors are in conflict. I think all those levels of conflict need to be changed through change of perspectives and embracing one another as brothers and sisters.
In other words, decolonizing the minds of the people. And of course, that's why we have programs like this, to, change mindsets and change the narrative across the African continent, especially as Africa is on the way towards change. Now, speaking of indigenous paths to peace, Dr. Eddie, you listen to your co-panelists and we'll acknowledge the fact that, there are challenges when it comes to integrating indigenous approaches into formal states' mechanisms of conflict resolution. But all the same, we equally know that, these indigenous conflict resolution practices, such as traditional councils, restorative justice systems, do differ from what we know is peculiar to the West. With all this said, when you look at some of these challenges, how can traditional peace-building practices be adapted to address, modern conflicts, including resources, technology, and globalization issues, related issues, peculiar to quelling these conflicts on the African continent?
We should not make the mistake of believing that what we call indigenous, knowledge, African knowledge, is static.
Yes.
Does not move, does not integrate, does not adapt, does not adjust, does not morph into new ways of doing things. And we have many examples in our, let's say, traditional societies and our villages. We want to take this as an example to show that. Whereby maybe 50 years ago, to resolve a conflict, you will probably bring a faction together and maybe slaughter this. I want to take people to Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. In the novel that describes, what the Umufia village. Of course, it is a fiction, but we all know for people like that who do, social criticism, that the writer was a kind of trying to perpetuate or put back in the post-colonial way, post-colonial mind, what was taken away from Africa in terms of bringing that knowledge, to this body of knowledge to the world, scholarship. When you look at that, the ways, in which people resolve conflicts in terms of somebody being killed, whether it is intentionally or inadvertently, today, those practices, are not in place. Things have changed. Another example that, we can also give, the world and African countries, were at the forefront, continue to fight, for instance, what we have called female genital mutilations, right? But the needle have moved. The needle has moved dramatically or significantly to the point that, not everybody in a so-called, cultures where you have this practice continue to believe in that being done, or even when they believe in that, the ways in which, it was performed in the past, today you have a much more sanitary conditions that are in there. I'm using these examples again, Sharon, to say very quickly that we should not again look at what we call indigenous, knowledge, African indigenous knowledge, as something that is static and that is not move. That does not move. It does move. It is homogeneous. it changes, and it also reflects the capacity of African people, right? Scholars, politicians, and you name them, village chiefs and all that, to adjust to the new realities. Today, Africa is the continent, or one of the continents, with the fast growing penetration of the internet. When we look at the platform economy, we are looking at in the transport sector, for instance, you have Uber, you have a Global, you have a Yango in certain countries. You have the use, therefore, of these applications to other food, to other transportation, to other whatever that you name, even to shop. People understand that their lives are being changed and are changing. How do we adjust, therefore, all of those things? There is a hope, in the sense that, number one, when you look at some African countries, people have decided that in the National Assembly, there should be a representation of traditional leaders. A country such as Sierra Leone move toward what we call constitutionalism, a mixture of people being elected, but also people being elected with people who have their mandate by the traditions of the villages, of the regions, and their societies. You have that in there. Today in Ghana, to take that example, you continue to have an important role played by the king of the Ashanti, of the Ashantis, right? The Asantehene continues to play a vital role in Ghana politics, for instance, even though the country has several states. You have many other African countries. The kingdom of Bugunda, for instance, in Uganda, has not completely vanished. That kingdom exists today. In there. How do we make use, therefore, of this in resolving even conflict or crisis within those countries at a local level? It exists. We have known a country such as Senegal, where the marabout, as we call them, the religious leaders, continue to play a vital role in the peaceful, durable, or the ways in which politics is waged in this country, in Senegal. To the point that, whatever direction sometimes that is being given by those religious clerics is what, more likely the political leaders will follow. And this has played into the stability that Senegal has maintained today in West Africa as one of the countries that has never experienced any political coup. Those things, therefore, Sharon, exist. How do we integrate them? Of course, here are some of the solutions I want to bring in here. Number one, we have a political science department. When you look at the agenda, you look at the curriculum, you look at the methodology that are used in there, there are clean copies of what? Euro-centered political science departments or methodologies. My question again is, how do we move? How do we empower those African think tanks? The institutes like, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, there are plenty of them everywhere. Institutes like, the Afrobarometers, for instance. How do we create many of those, and how do we actually empower the researchers in there, the intellectuals in there, in moving toward creating this African methodology? In the United States, for instance, you have what we call the Afro-centered, right, a methodology that have informed quite a number of scholarship in universities like Temple University, where I was, myself. This is one thing that, is possible to do, because it does not come from anywhere. When it comes to political institutions as well, as I said, the example of Sierra Leone at the time is something that needs to be repeated, right? It does not suffice to say a leader saying, oh, I'm creating the Senate and then I'm going to be appointing people.
Yeah.
Whether you appointed that, what is the nature? What is the demographic? What is the identity? What is the traditional clout that, what these people have that, what you name? What is the role that women are playing? What is the role that traditional leaders who represent, of course, our cultures today will be playing in there? Solution number two. Solution number three, very quickly.
Dr. Eddie?
Joint Yeah, I'm
Sorry to
sorry.
cut
Yeah, I
you
know we are
short
running out
before,
of time.
you
But I want
proceed
to
with...
say, Sharon, very quickly
Okay.
that it's been a pleasure to be in there. This is the topic that we can come back on again
Yes,
at
sure, sure,
on another
sure.
occasion.
Please kindly proceed.
Oh, thank you. So I wanted to say very quickly that we also have in all of the African countries have in their constitutions a clear disposition of solidarity toward African countries in the same of their belief in the African Union. It used to be the Organization of African Unity. It is clearly labeled or stipulated in all of those constitutions the importance of contributing to regional peace, regional cooperation. This is a high time to come back to that again and making sure that, this regional organization that we have created, the East African Community, the ECOWAS, and all of them, SADC, here and there, truly play and abide by the rules that they edicted themselves instead of playing the double standard game. Where is the double standard? When there is a coup in one country, oh, we can be quiet. When there's a coup in another country, oh, no, we want to impose sanctions here and there. This contributes to the lack of solidarity and the perpetuation of the crisis that we are talking about in here. Very quickly, a country such as Kenya, like many other countries, came up and say, we are eliminating, visas, for all Africans, who are traveling to Kenya. I think this is something that, the African countries need to study carefully and arrive at the solution whereby when we agree that, the free movement of goods is goods, to be redundant in there, for the African country in terms of a trade and business and commerce, we got to understand that it is much more important for people to move freely. Today in Africa, goods can move from one country to another much more. It is easy for goods to move from one country to another than it is for people to move from one country to another. It is, a headache for people to travel around West Africa, from even Nigeria to Ivory Coast, or from these are issues that we need to resolve, because where people move with their culture, people move with integration. And this also plays into resolving conflicts, into creating this type of integration that we want to see. The South-South cooperation is there as well. But Sharon, we don't want to eat too much of your time. The last point I want to make here is the cultural identities. When I listen to speakers on some other shows talking about the crisis in Cameroon, for instance, let's take this example, I hear people talk about the Francophone community and Anglophone community. I am one of those people who believe that we should move away from these identities that are putting us in boxes and that do not reflect who we are. My culture, the one I am from originally, is closer to the Ga and the Ashanti culture, but yet somebody will call me a Francophone person because I'm from Ivory Coast, and they call themselves, an Anglophone because they're from Ghana. What does that mean, Anglophone? I have not ever heard of a French person calling themselves Francophone. They're French. So either we are Ivorian, at least even those entities being created by colonization, or we are Africans, we are Akan, we are Swahili speakers, we are, you name it. We need to kill those ones as well. And my co-panelists talked about the role that the workers should play. When today you have poverty, when today you have workers who are not enjoying the fruits of their labor, meaning that people are not well paid, when you have the informal labor sector being the most important in our African countries, the informal labor sector being dominated by women who can be in the streets as vendors but come back home and still being poor without social protections, Sharon, I believe that these are things that our African leaders, the African countries, need to work on, and will have a clear implication on the ways in which crises erupt in our countries and the ways in which we resolve them. And I want to land on that one by thanking you for this other opportunity that you gave us to be on this show. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Eddie. Of course, due to time constraint, we might not be able to really, dive right in deep, but then we believe you learned a lot from today's conversation, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Dr. Eddie, for your insight on today's edition of the program.
My pleasure.
I will equally say thank you, Boniface Harrison, for your brilliant insight equally on contributing to the success of Talking Point.